World War II may have come to an end, but certainly the wartime allies were now squaring off against each other in what would be the titanic struggle for the world. Nothing short of world domination being on the table. And by the end of 1945, the Grand Alliance that had won World War II was in shambles. Any realistic hope of a post-war world constructed along American lines, that one world vision, was no longer possible. And so the West would work to contain the threat of further Soviet expansion. And although we'll talk about it in a minute, this becomes the guiding ideology of the American government. Not only in the 1940s, but the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s. With some permutations and changes, the American view will be we have to prevent the Soviet Union from expanding. And the first real area that it takes place, the first real test you might consider of American resolve, will come in Iran. The new doctrine received one test before it was fully formulated, and that would be in March of 1946, when the Soviets refused to follow the Americans and pull out of Iran. Iran had been partially occupied by all three powers, and as Britain and the United States withdrew, the Soviets refused. And what we see is that the new president, Harry Truman, Harry Truman's favorite game, by the way, was poker. He was very good at it. And Harry Truman, calling the Soviet bluff, tells them, if you don't withdraw from Iran, we will come back into Iran and we will stay. And so Stalin, not wishing to challenge the West yet, pulls out of Iran. The lesson being, with the Soviet Union standing firm produces success. But Stalin was putting heavy pressure elsewhere, and you can see on the map in the center of the page that the Soviet Union controls the northern Black Sea. In fact, in Crimea, which has been recently in the news, Crimea is a major staging port for Soviet naval vessels. But to leave the Black Sea and enter the Mediterranean, hence the Atlantic, they have to pass through the choke point of the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, that point between Greece and Turkey. And so it had been the goal of the Tsars, and certainly the goal of Stalin, to control Greece and Turkey, if not directly adding them to the Soviet Union, at least bringing governments favorable to the Soviet Union into those areas. And so in the post-war era, 1945, as those areas are liberated from German control, specifically Greece, the Comintern movement and Stalin's communist forces began pumping money and resources into the Communist Party of Greece and the Communist Party of Turkey. And in both areas, they seek to destabilize the Western-leaning government and bring about a communist revolution. In fact, in early 1947, Winston Churchill, who's now back in power, I didn't make a slip, Winston Churchill's back in power in England, visits with Harry Truman, and he says the British government is on the verge of economic collapse, and that the British government can no longer subsidize the governments of Greece and Turkey to suppress the communist insurgents. So if the United States wants something done about Greece and Turkey, they will have to pay for it and they will have to do it. And so Truman, in seeking advice on how to go about this, is provided advice from George F. Kennan. He was a lawyer working in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, and he would create a document for the president that's kind of entered State Department history. It was called the Long Telegram. It was a 5,000-word telegram sent from Moscow to Washington. I don't know if you've ever received a telegram. Telegrams generally aren't used these days, but back in the day where you paid for each letter and word that you sent, telegrams were quite expensive, and so the common person didn't send very long telegrams. You know, it might be, meet you tomorrow, stop. We'll be at such and such, stop. See you there. Well, a 5,000-word telegram, and in that telegram, Kennan spells out the containment doctrine. He said that the only way the United States is going to succeed in its conflict with the Soviet Union is through long, patient, persistent resistance. That we have to stop, that Stalin is the schoolyard bully. And the only way you can stop a bully is not allowing him to control. And so the containment doctrine, and Kennan becomes known as the father of the containment doctrine, writing his theory in the magazine Foreign Affairs for public consumption. This will become the guiding philosophy of all of the presidents from Truman to Ronald Reagan, containing the expansion of communism while at the same time trying to push back where they can. And so the first major test of the idea that is containment will come in Greece and Turkey. Truman goes to Congress on March 12th, 1947. March the 12th, 1947, Truman appears before Congress and lays it out. If there was any uncertainty about when the Cold War began, if you want to go back to the Soviet declaration of war and say August 1945 is when the Cold War began, or sometime clearly by March 12, 1947, there is a Cold War. He goes before Congress and he says, if you don't want these two countries going communist, then you are going to have to pay the bill. He requests $400 million to bolster the armed forces of Greece and Turkey. This is known as the Greek-Turkish Aid Bill. And it would stabilize both countries and prevent them from going communist. $400 million. Truman stated this in his address to Congress, and when a president says something like this, he's establishing public policy. He said, and I quote, "I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures," end quote. So we call that the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine is only one half of containment. All right, so the Truman Doctrine, that we must resist the attempted subjugation of nations by armed minorities or by outside pressures, that's the military half, if you will, of containment. So the Truman Doctrine is just part of containment. But the other part of containment is again spelled out by Winston Churchill, in which in 1946, in talking with President Truman and General George Catlett Marshall, who becomes Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, and you see him meeting Truman. George C. Marshall, as you remember from the World War II, was the advisor to President Roosevelt. In meeting with those two, Churchill said, Europe is still in shambles. All of Europe is in shambles. There is no industrial recovery. And as the old axiom goes, desperate times produce desperate measures. He said the communists are exploiting the conditions all across Europe, whether it be France, or Italy, or Germany, or Austria, Denmark, the Netherlands. All the conditions are being exploited. I mean, look at the pictures of these cities. These cities are in utter ruin. There is no industry. There is no commerce. There is nothing even approaching a functioning country. And Churchill warns, if you don't do something about the economic recovery of Europe, it's going to ultimately lead to all of Europe going communist. That's not just a scare tactic. These people are desperate. They need food. There's no food coming in from the countrysides. What people are producing in the countrysides are keeping it for themselves. There's no relief efforts. Where the army controls in Germany and in Berlin, especially in Western Berlin, the American zone, American soldiers are providing for the Berliners, providing them food and basic sustenance. But that's not going to last long, especially when you have the communists in the sector next to you saying, hey, everything's good over here. It's a lie, but it's a lie people want to believe. And in fact, quite opposite is true. Conditions are so bad in East Berlin that East Berliners are crossing over into West Berlin to eat. And in fact, the military has to tighten control and prevent the Soviet-controlled East Berliners from coming into the American zone just to get food. Because we're paying, in essence, to feed the Soviet populace and getting nothing in return. So the idea was we need to do something to save Europe. We need something to prime the pump, to restart the engine of European industry. First off, because it's the right humanitarian thing to do, to relieve the people's suffering and not see them starve. Secondly, economic. Europe is going to continue to be a drain on the American economy until it can be self-sufficient. And so it's whether, do you want to pay more over the course of time, or do you want to pay a lot up front, but get it started so that you reduce the cost over time? And so June of 1947, Secretary of State George C. Marshall, in speaking at a Harvard commencement address, announces a plan to provide economic assistance to Europe. He drafts a program for economic recovery, and he invites all nations of Europe to attend a summit in Paris. And at that summit, notice, and I had to correct myself because I wanted to say Western Europe, but this was open to all the countries of Europe, including the Soviet Union, including Poland, including Czechoslovakia, Romania, etc. All those areas under Soviet control. They're invited to attend. But Marshall says at this conference, we're not just going to open up the checkbook and give you a blank check. We want to know how you're going to spend this money for economic recovery. This isn't, especially in the case of the Soviets, this isn't a handout so you can build more weapons to threaten the United States. Now, the Soviet counter to this, Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov is going to say, you know, what you're trying to do is reshape Europe in your image, and we don't like it. And we don't like telling you how we're going to spend our money. Now, this plan, which is often called the Marshall Plan, and that's its common name, but it's truly called the Economic Recovery Program. The Economic Recovery Program, or the Marshall Plan. As the meeting took place, Molotov and his entourage of Eastern Bloc economic leaders are seated. Molotov brings with him like 200 economists from the Soviet Union. And as the sessions begin and Marshall calls for their plans to be submitted, Molotov declares that this is a Western plot to spy on the Soviet Union and Eastern European nations. He stands up and he and the entire Soviet bloc walk out. So the economic recovery plan program becomes exclusively for Western Europe, but not because that was the intention of the United States. It was by direction of the Soviet Union. And so the economic recovery plan over the next 3 years would pump some $12 billion in American aid into Western Europe. It would restart the engine, if you will, of industry. And just so you think about this, as the United States demobilized and these young men who have served their nation in the Pacific or in Europe return home, they're returning to what jobs? Remember, it wasn't the New Deal that ended the Great Depression. It was World War II. Now World War II is over, and many feel that Americans are going to return to a Great Depression. So as they come home to limited to no jobs. They come home to a kind of a bleak economic existence. Now, most of these servicemen are going to take advantage of the GI Bill, and they're going to go to college, they're going to learn a trade, they're going to learn a craft. But many, like my grandfather, he wasn't cut out for college work. He wanted to go into the trades, and he found a job and started working. But in 1945, the fall of 1945, the American economy began slipping back into depression. But with the onset of the Cold War and the increase in spending, it kept American industry going. But once the economic recovery program was passed and that millions of dollars, $12 billion, began being pumped into Europe, that became a fuel for the American economic engine. Let me demonstrate this to you. Here at UT Tyler, if you drive just a few miles, you'll get to I-20. Head on I-20 eastward to a little place next door to us, Longview. In Longview, and I passed these as a kid. My grandparents lived in Kilgore. My grandfather worked at Texas Eastman. I can't tell you how many times as a kid driving on I-20 from Kilgore to Texas Eastman, take my grandfather to work. You'd see these big domed buildings off of I-20, off to the left. Well, in those big domed buildings, there was a company that produced huge earth-moving equipment. That company was Laterno. The Laterno company made giant bulldozers and giant dump trucks and giant earth-moving equipment. Well, where do you think Europe is going to spend that $12 billion? Look at, backing up for a second to a picture of those cities. They've got tons and tons and tons of rubble that have to be moved so a new city can be built on the ruins. You're not going to do that brick by brick. It's going to take massive movers to do it. And where are they going to get it? They have no industry. They have no chance to build those things. Where are they going to get it? They're going to buy it from the United States. Companies like Laterno or CAT or across the nation, any company that produces that equipment is going to sell it to Europe. And so that American investment of $12 billion may be going to Europe, but it's coming back home. Also, Europe can't feed itself. Its farms are destroyed. And in 46 and 47, Europe undergoes a drought. And so a lot of that $12 billion is coming back to the United States to buy food, to buy wheat, to buy corn, to buy necessities. And so it's not only helping American industry, it's helping American farms. And so as Europe buys American goods, it drives the American economy. And so what is often considered the European economic miracle, which is only eclipsed by the Asian economic miracle, Japan's recovery. Germany and Japan are going to within 10 years, have recovered their industrial capacity. It sets off in the United States a period equal to the 1920s, the 1950s, called the affluent society, to equal the roaring 20s of the 1920s. And I would argue that a lot of it comes from the economic stimulus provided by the Marshall Plan. And that Marshall's ideas stabilize Western Europe, and that is the second part of the containment doctrine. You not only have the military side of the Truman Doctrine, you have the economic side of the Marshall Plan. And with that, by the end of 1950, European industrial production had risen 64%. At that same time, communist influence declined. And American trade with Europe had been restored to pre-World War I levels. And so the United States enjoys an economic recovery fueled directly or indirectly by the Cold War. And so the economic recovery program proved to be a huge success. But also necessary with the Cold War restructuring of the economy and providing for Europe, and that there is an ongoing conflict, there needed to be some type of restructuring of the U.S. government. And so the National Security Act of 1947 was yet another indicator that the Cold War was here to stay. The National Security Act of 1947 did away with the old War Department and created the new Department of Defense. The War Department was replaced by the Department of Defense, which presided over the Department of the Navy, the Department of the Army, and it separated from the Army the Air Force. And so the U.S. Air Force became a separate branch of the armed forces under the Department of Defense. Why? Because this new Cold War is going to be predicated on air power. Secondly, the National Security Act of 1947 created the NSC, the National Security Council, a designated group of advisors that, depending on the president's whim or desire, changes from administration to administration. But the National Security Council provides the president with direct military and foreign affairs advice. One of the most effective classes I ever had in political science and foreign policy. The instructor for most of the semester divided us up, and we were the NSC. My role was Secretary of Defense, and we had to provide the president, which was the instructor, day-to-day updates on world affairs, which meant we had to go read the newspaper. We didn't have internet in that day. We had to go read the newspaper and get up to date on the issues, and then at the start of each class, each department had to give the president an update in our areas. It was a tough class to always stay up on world affairs, and you kind of got a glimpse of what it must be like for the president's daily briefing on national security affairs. A third thing that was accomplished by the National Security Act was the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency. Realizing that you can't always use a sledgehammer to accomplish your will, it was determined that the Central Intelligence Agency would do a number of things. That it would be the spy network. It replaced the old wartime Office of Strategic Services. The OSS had been our spy network against the Germans. It was replaced by the CIA. That it gathered information on foreign countries both through overt and covert methods. And if needed, and probably all too frequently during the Cold War, it provided means of eliminating foreign opposition without recourse to war. And for those who whine and complain today, oh, the evil CIA, well, think of how many wars we were prevented or avoided because an enemy leader was taken out. Rightly or wrongly, the non-existence of the CIA probably would have been far worse than its existence. And so the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency. Problems are going to quickly develop, though, as the United States begins providing for European recovery. One of the areas that stress begins to be seen, and remember what I told you, that the Cold War can be understood like tectonic plates, where the two superpowers rub up against each other is where there's going to be friction. And the prime area where the two are abutted are in Germany. Not only in Germany, but as you can see on the little inset, Berlin itself. Berlin as the capital is the significant heart of Germany. And Berlin is deep within the Soviet zone. So not only do you have Germany divided into four, you have Berlin itself divided into four. The problem is that the West wants to unify its sector and to make it self-sufficient so that it's no longer a drain on their economies. The Soviets don't want Germany unified. Instead, they want Germany fragmented. They want Germany broken into as many sectors as it possibly can be. And so as... Sorry about that. As the Western powers began unifying their sectors, and one of the key indicators that they were going to produce a unified Western Germany is they began taking out of circulation all of the Nazi currency and began implementing a new German mark. Great Britain and the United States decide to unify their two sectors, and so the U.S. zone and the British zone are unified into one zone called Bizonia. Bizonia. The French don't want to join Bizonia, but are forced ultimately through 1947 into 1948 to do so. And so the French join Bizonia and it becomes Trizonia. And they use Trizonia because they still don't want to formally announce a government. They would like to see Eastern Germany reattached and all of it become one country. Joseph Stalin decides to oppose this attempted unification. And if the country is going to be unified, then he wants Berlin to be exclusively Soviet. Berlin is the ideological and the patriotic heart of Germany. Stalin decides that he wants control of the heart of Germany, which is Berlin. And so he announces in the spring of 1948, he does kind of a trial run and shuts off Western access to Berlin and then quickly reopens it. But this begins the American high command thinking that this has a potential for being re-implemented. And in fact, Stalin does that very thing on June 24th, 1948. He announces that all road and railroad access into Berlin are cut off. I'm off that. Why didn't he shut off air travel as well? Well, he knew that would be the final straw. I mean, that's the Allies are going to have to stand up to him with that. He also didn't believe that enough supplies could come into Berlin to feed the American troops and Allied troops, much less feed the city. So by declaring a blockade, if you will, and so this is known as the Berlin blockade, he shuts off all land access into the Soviet zone. He's going to try to force West Berlin to surrender because they starve to death. that to save face, to preserve the population, or that the West Berlin population would simply defect to the East Berlin, cross over into the Soviet zone, and it would depopulate Berlin to the point the West had no purpose in being there. Truman went to his chief of staff, and he said, what can we do? And one advisor said, well, let's send a tank division, supply trucks with a tank division in the lead into the Soviet sector. If they're fired upon, then go to it. It's like, whoa. We don't want World War III here. And a tank division going down the road, somebody's going to get an itchy trigger, and that's going to be that. Same thing with the train. So the idea was kind of put forward by the new Air Force. General Hap Arnold and General Curtis LeMay both suggest that Berlin could in fact be resupplied exclusively from the air. Most of the people thought this was an insane idea. It had never been done before, and they didn't see how it could be done now. But in conjunction with our allies, and you see the list of roundels, the aircraft markings that I have on the side of the slide, you see the U.S. Air Force insignia, which, by the way, replaces the old Army Air Corps insignia. You see the RAF, the Royal Air Force roundel. You see the Royal Australian Air Force roundel with the kangaroo. The Royal New Zealand Air Force with the kiwi bird, and the South African Air Force with the gazelle. All of these part of the British Commonwealth, all of them, since Britain's involved, they're going to be involved. In the United States, the resupply of Berlin was called Operation Vittles. The Royal Air Force called it Operation Plainfare. The Royal Australian Air Force called it Operation Pelican. Either way, it all stands for the same thing, resupplying Allied troops and ultimately the city of Berlin through the air. And Curtis LeMay and Hap Arnold's vision became a reality. And it became Stalin's nightmare. There are the logistics of resupplying Berlin by the air were phenomenally complex. And so what emerges over the course of the almost year that the Berlin airlift will operate, flying out of airfields in West Germany. Now, understand, the aircraft that are flying into West Berlin are only coming from West Germany. But then the supplies that they're carrying into West Berlin have to be flown in from around the world. So you have huge staging areas in West Germany, and then from there, the supplies are airlifted into West Berlin. There were clear air routes designated by the Allied High Command, by the U.S. Air Force and the Royal Air Force. And now, this through trial and error, it will be decided that there will be certain routes going into the city and certain routes coming out. So you don't have to worry about airplanes colliding. You always stay in your designated area of departure. And then once you're out of the airspace of the Soviet airspace of East Germany, then you can take routes to your home airfields. And so the idea that planes flying around the clock can supply a city the size of Berlin, a city of 2 million people, plus the service personnel from France, Britain, and the United States. I should say not only Great Britain, but the United Kingdom, because it's all of the Commonwealth. New Zealanders, Australians, South Africans, Canadians, all participating. Now, you didn't see Canada because Canada declined to participate, but the planes you see on the PowerPoint here are the planes that participated, all of the various types of planes that participated in the Berlin airlift. Now, the most common was the C-47 Skytrain and the C-54 Skymaster. You see the Skymaster on the backdrop. But all of these planes participated. If you notice the plane in the center, It is a seaplane. They discovered that, the airports became so congested, and there's only 2 or 3 airports that could be used to land all of these planes, and it's around-the-clock air operation, and the skies above these airfields became so congested that they determined they could fly supplies in via the river. There's a river that runs through the heart of Berlin, and there was a section in the western zone that was straight enough that a seaplane could land on it. So they even began supplying Berlin via seaplane. Now, the first thing that had to happen, you've got to gather these planes from around the globe. And I've been reading a book, I believe it was by Richard Reeves, on the Berlin airlift. And he talks about most of these pilots had just gotten home. They are demobilized in 45, 46, sent home. They're just reacquainting with their wives, starting families, getting into civilian occupations. Many of them are in civilian aviation. The mechanics are getting started in their, they were discharged from the Army Air Corps. They go home. They're working for an airline now. And all of a sudden, the demands of the Berlin airlift, they're drafted back into service. So pilots and air crews and mechanics are all called back to work the Berlin airlift. So beginning June 24th, 1948, with the declaration of the blockade, the U.S. began flying in these planes. So first you have to gather the planes from around the globe, of course leaving those commands in the Pacific almost totally devoid of transport aircraft as they focus on the Berlin airlift. But you have to bring in the planes, you have to bring in the air crews. Then they had to make runways operational, and they simply didn't have enough personnel to do it. And so across Berlin and West Germany, they brought in civilians, and I didn't put any pictures on here of the civilian population, especially of West Berlin, working to make airfields operational and to expand other runways. These runways have been bombed almost out of existence by the bombers of World War II. B-17s and B-24s had just dumped payload after payload on these airfields. So to get them back in condition where planes can land on them, there are stories of Berliners working for cigarettes, for food. What food they get from the Army, they're getting as wages as they go out and by hand are filling in the craters. And there are stories of women wearing evening gowns because it's the only clothes they had left. They don't have work clothes. I mean, their homes have been destroyed. So whatever clothes they could find, women in heels and evening gowns out shoveling rubble into crater holes. And then the pavers paving it over, making runways operational, especially at Tempelhof Airfield, for the airlift to land. And land it did, bringing in supply after supply after supply. These planes flying around the clock, flying in, as you see in the left corner, flying in milk, flying in flour, flying in supplies of all kinds that will then be used to feed the population of Berlin. Everything that is consumed, everything that is worn, everything that is used to make heat has to be flown in. This airlift goes from June of 1948. You don't really have to worry about a lot of heating coal and things like that in the summertime. But this is going to run through the winter of 1948 and 1949, ultimately coming to an end in the summer of 1949. And it will serve as an enduring symbol of American might, if you will, of the West's resolve. And they fly in everything that a populace of 2 million needs to function. Now, they're not eating filet mignon, but they are eating. In fact, some of the residents of West Berlin ate better during the Berlin airlift than they had before the blockade. And I was reading Reeves' book. Cigarettes became an element of currency that a packet of cigarettes, would get hours of labor from some of the German residents. And by the way, it's mostly German women and children doing the work at these airfields. Most of the men had served in the army and are either in prisoner of war camps somewhere else or are dead. And so this is a major undertaking, Operation Vittles. Over the course of the 10 months that the Berlin airlift operated, Stalin holding out through the winter of 48-49, thinking that the airlift would collapse in the winter weather, that the planes wouldn't be able to fly, they wouldn't be able to get the supplies in, and that Berlin would starve during the winter. That didn't happen. And they flew in around the clock 2.5 million tons of material. 2.5 million tons of material. And these pilots pulled off a social and economic miracle. At the height of the Berlin airlift, as one of the pilots, and you see how close the planes are, the same picture that's the backdrop is shown here. You see how low the planes had to go. Crossing into Tempelhof on certain airfields, they had to make a tight turn, and then as they crossed the outer marker, crowds of kids would gather and wave at the planes as they landed, and the pilots would wave back. Well, on one of those flights, Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen decided to drop candy to some kids that were gathered out there. So he made a little homemade parachute, and you see the modern picture of Gail Halvorsen taken just a few years ago in the middle at the bottom, with an example of a parachute made from a handkerchief. And he tied the candy in a little bundle on this parachute, and as he was on final approach, as he crossed over the perimeter fence, he dropped that parachute out his cockpit window, and it fluttered down to the kids. Well, next time he came in, he noticed that there were more kids. And Gail Halvorsen developed a real love of the people of Berlin. He would often, when pilots would land while their planes are being unloaded, the pilots or air crews would either sleep or eat or circulate in the population. Well, he went out to the crowds and talked to the crowds, and he told them, the next time I come in, I'll drop you candy. And they, well, how will we know who you are? He said, well, I'll wag my wings as I approach. And so every time he flew in, he would drop candy to the increasing number of kids, and he earned the nickname Uncle Wagelflugel, Uncle Waggle Wings. He was known to some as the Candy Bomber. Well, the government bureaucracy being the government bureaucracy, it got back to the commanders of the air wings that you've got pilots dropping candy to kids, and that can't be a good thing. Typical administration, if there's joy to be had, they're going to suck the life out of it. So no, we can't do that. You might crash your plane trying to drop candy to kids, so it's a hazard. Don't do it. But then the letters started coming in, letter upon letter upon letter from the people of West Berlin. My God, what is it with you people? You're taking care of us. You're feeding us. You're defiantly standing up to the Soviet Union, and you're feeding us. You're taking care of our clothing needs and our heating needs, and you're even remembering the kids. Wow, what a great country you are. And as letter after letter began pouring into the Pentagon and into the Air Force High Command, well, suddenly a bureaucrat got the great idea, hey, let's have all the pilots do this. And so it was often called Operation Little Vittles, and more and more pilots would drop. Well, Gail Halvorsen got a letter from one of the kids, and it said, you've been dropping candy to the kids, and I'm injured. I lost my leg in a mine explosion during the war, and I'm on crutches or in a wheelchair, and I can't get to the candy, and when you drop it, all the other kids get it. But I've studied your flight plan, and if you drop just a little bit early, I'll be at this particular intersection, and if you drop the candy there, all the kids will be out at the perimeter fence, and I'll get some. So we did that. Then the letter started pouring in. You're even remembering the disabled children. Oh my. And so this hugely backfired on the Soviet Union. This was a display of might that the Soviet Union could not have duplicated. And the U.S. and their Western allies were able to feed this city for 10 months. Berlin emerged from the Berlin blockade stronger and more unified than it went in. And in fact, the Soviets suffered a huge propaganda nightmare as this Berlin airlift wore on and on. The pilots who died, and there were many who died in crashes, became national heroes. In fact, Gail Havorsen, whom you see there, was asked, he was considered a German national hero. I've got his medal there. It's the highest medal that a non-German can receive from the German government. The government of West Germany, now today Germany, honored Gail Havorsen with that honor. And they asked him in one of the most recent Olympics, they asked Gail Havorsen to lead the German Olympians into the stadium, a non-German leading Germans into the stadium, and they have a burial plot reserved that if he should decide upon his death to be buried in Germany, that he will be buried in German soil. It was also given to Gail Havorsen as the German government decided to close Tempelhof Airfield quite recently. Gail Havorsen flew the last airplane into Tempelhof Airfield. And then as soon as his plane landed, it was turned into a static display for people to see, and the runways were busted up and turned into parks. And so the Berlin blockade turned into a huge American success. Not only did it not prevent the unification of Germany, quite the opposite, it accelerated the unification of not only the German sectors, but all of Western Europe. On April 4th, 1949, to meet any potential Soviet threat, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was created, with Dwight Eisenhower serving as the first head of NATO, with all of those member countries, and then the three that are added later, the Republic of Turkey, Greece, and then Germany itself, the Federal Republic of Germany, added later. And I know there have been countries added since, but this is the countries of the Cold War that were added. And so NATO emerges from the Berlin airlift. NATO is a display of Western strength in Europe. And then the ultimate impact of the Berlin airlift was speeding the unification of West Germany. On October 1949, Germany was officially divided into two nations. The western half became known as the Federal Republic of Germany. The eastern half, under Soviet control, became the Democratic Republic of Germany. And so to answer NATO, on May 14th, 1955, the Soviets created the Warsaw Pact, a defensive alliance to answer any Western aggression. In both sections, and an attack on one is considered an attack on all, whether it be the Warsaw Pact or NATO. And these are your wartime military alliances. 1948 is an election year, and while Harry Truman, who had been vice president and ascended to the presidency, he's going to seek re-election in 1948. Facing Truman will be Franklin Roosevelt's opponent, Thomas Dewey, and a third-party challenge from within the Democratic Party from Strom Thurmond. Strom Thurmond is from South Carolina and led a coalition of Southern Democrats in opposition to Harry Truman's civil rights stance, his movement on the 1946 Civil Rights Bill. Strom Thurmond is going to oppose Harry Truman with a political party known as the Dixiecrats. And so with the Democratic Party divided, it looks initially like the election will go for Dewey. In fact, the famous photo of the Chicago Tribune, Dewey wins, which had to be published before all the votes were counted. Well, in fact, Dewey doesn't win. Truman wins re-election, and in 1949 begins a term as president in his own right. Quite possibly, Harry Truman regretted his second time in office, whereas his first term in office, everything seemed to go his way. The success of the Berlin airlift, the success in Iran, the success in Greece and Turkey. But all of that kind of came crumbling down in his second term of office. And while he was still a strong, forceful leader, events seemed to undermine his presidency. And all of it came to be centered around the Soviet acquisition of the atomic bomb. The question became, how did the Soviets get an atomic bomb so quickly? All of the CIA and OSS spine indicated that the Soviets were a decade to 2 decades behind the United States in scientific progress. And so they began investigating, and they centered on one scientist in particular, Klaus Emil Julius Fuchs. Klaus Fuchs was a naturalized British subject that had been a Manhattan Project scientist. And he had been sending secrets to his courier, Harry Gold, codename Raymond, who had been sending those secrets to his KGB case officer, Semyon Markovich Semyonov, codenamed Twin, who was then forwarding them to the USSR's UN General Counsel, Anatoly Yatskov, in the Soviet delegation in New York City. As Klaus Fuchs is captured by the British and interrogated, he gives up Harry Gold. When Harry Gold is captured in the United States and interrogated, he gives up his contact, Julius Rosenberg. Julius Rosenberg, an electrical engineer working for the U.S. Army Signal Corps, is investigated, and his codename, by the way, was Liberal. And in his interrogation, it's revealed that his brother-in-law, David Greenglass, codename Caliber, were both spies. Rosenberg insisted that he was working alone. But upon interrogation, Greenglass gives up not only his evidence on Rosenberg, but implicates his sister, Ethel Greenglass Rosenberg, which you see on the left of the two women. That's Julius Rosenberg's wife, which is David Greenglass's sister. He informs the investigator, the FBI, that his sister was an agent as well, that she typed up the reports and the information that Rosenberg stole from the Manhattan Project. Now, the argument has always been that Greenglass gave up his sister to save his wife, Ruth Lee Prince Greenglass, because they had 2 kids. Well, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are going to be found guilty of espionage and are going to be executed. They have 2 little boys. Further evidence has indicated, because many claim that the Rosenbergs were wrongfully executed, but further investigation has proven they both were spies. And in fact, Greenglass, who gave them up, got some immunity from the death penalty, and instead only got 9 years in prison, I believe was his term. And his wife was protected, but she was a spy too. She was a typist who typed up reports. So a huge spy ring discovered feeding information to the Soviets that allowed the Soviets to get an atomic bomb years ahead of when it was expected. Not only does Truman have to deal with the Rosenberg spy case, showing that the Manhattan Project, and while that had been a Franklin Roosevelt deal, it showed that Soviet agents were operating throughout top secret areas. But even worse, there was accusations against a State Department official, Alger Hiss, who was an undersecretary in the State Department, who was vouched for by Truman and the Secretary of State for his loyalty. But he insisted that he was innocent. Alger Hiss, until his dying day, insisted that he was innocent. He was accused by the man on the bottom left, Whittaker Chambers, of being a spy. And that Whittaker Chambers had been the courier for Alger Hiss's documents to the Soviet agents. Alger Hiss is called in a series of lies and ultimately is convicted in the court of public opinion of espionage when Whittaker Chambers produces microfilm that he had hidden in a pumpkin. Hence they're known as the Pumpkin Papers. While many wanted to give up on Hiss, Richard Nixon, a House member and a member of the House Un-American Activities Committee, which the HUAC is often given a bad rap because of its pursuit of communists. But the HUAC was created by the Democrats, was created by Franklin Roosevelt to pursue Nazis in the government. But after the end of World War II, that same agency was then used to pursue communists working in the U.S. government. The problem is it's not illegal to be a communist and work for the U.S. government. It is illegal to sell secrets. But the suspicion is that if you're communist and you work for the U.S. government, your allegiance is with the communist, not the United States. And in a condescending and bitter exchange between Nixon and Alger Hiss, Nixon makes it his personal goal to destroy Hiss. The problem is the Pumpkin Papers and all the collateral evidence indicates that Alger Hiss was a spy, but the statute of limitations had passed. And so Richard Nixon got the only, and my colleagues on the left have always argued, well, if Hiss was guilty of espionage, he'd been tried as a traitor. Well, the statute of limitations prevented that. And so Richard Nixon went for the only conviction he could get so that Alger Hiss didn't get off scot-free. He went for a perjury conviction, which he got. And Alger Hiss spent 2 5-year sentences concurrent, so I think he was 3.5 years in jail for perjury under oath. Now that the Soviet archives are open, and you can read about this on your own if you wish, but it appears that in the Soviet archives, and both sides go back and forth on this, but the indication is that Alger Hiss was in fact a major Soviet spy in the State Department, feeding documents to the Soviet Union. And so Harry Truman is dealing with not only spies in the atomic bomb program, he's dealing with spies in the federal government, and this opens up the entirety of the democratically controlled government. Remember, the Democrats have been in charge of most branches of government since 1932. And it opens them up to 18 years of control. It's time for a change. And so Alger Hiss is indicative and used by the right, especially a senator from Wisconsin, Joseph McCarthy, to accuse the administration of being infiltrated by communists. And I'll leave to your reading the details of McCarthyism. In addition to the nightmare of communists in the government, in May of 1948, the British mandate in Palestine expired and Israel declared its statehood. Harry Truman and the United States were one of the first, if not the first nation to recognize Israel as an independent country, and in so doing to grant them aid when, the day after the Arab-Israeli War begins. And so Middle Eastern affairs become a nightmare for President Truman as all of the Middle East rallies against Israel. And in the almost year-long Arab-Israeli War, Israel not only survives, pushes back against its attackers, and occupies lands that are disputed even today. And so the attempt to eliminate Israel and to create a Palestinian state began in 1948, the Arab-Israeli War, making Middle Eastern politics a hassle for President Truman. And then Far Eastern politics becomes a problem for the president when the Chinese Civil War that had been going on for decades turns against the American ally Chiang Kai-shek. And the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong gained control in 1949, gained control of a majority of China and forced the nationalist Chinese out of mainland China. They take refuge on the island of Formosa, and Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek now becomes President Chiang Kai-shek and creates the new nation of Taiwan. And so Chiang Kai-shek, our ally in the Pacific, December 21st, 1949, becomes instrumental in creating a state of Taiwan that China still claims is their territory, but the nationalist Chinese of Taiwan want a return to Asia and return to mainland China. Now, we're going to break this up because 1950 becomes a nightmare for Harry Truman. The nightmare begins in the summer of 1950 with the Korean War. But keep in mind, December 1949, Taiwan has become an independent state. But these are nationalist Chinese that want to return to China and reopen the Chinese Civil War. Korea becomes a platform through which that becomes a possibility. And we will look at the coming of the Korean War next time.